Before they were mothers, Leto and Niobe had been the most devoted of friends. That is a poem by ancient Greek poetess and lesbian extraordinaire Sappho, and this is in reference to an ancient Greek myth about Queen Niobe. Now, the story goes like this. Basically, Niobe was this very proud queen who had 14 children, 7 sons, 7 daughters. Because, of course, why anyone would want that many kids is entirely beyond me. But the fact is, she had 14 kids, she was very proud of them. Move on. Now, one day, Niobe sees all her people going to pay tribute to the goddess Leto, who was the mother of Artemis and Apollo. And she becomes angry by this. She says, Leto has only 2 children. I have 14. I am at least 12 units better than this goddess. You should pay tribute to me. And since she was queen, it wasn't so much a suggestion as it was a royal decree, so all of the people had to take the offerings from Leto's temple and give them to Niobe. Unbeknownst to all, Leto was in fact there in disguise, and she saw all this, and she was like, not gonna fly. And as we all know, the only thing worse than the wrath of a queen is the wrath of a goddess. So, Leto enlisted the help of her 2 children, Artemis and Apollo, to exact her revenge upon Queen Niobe. And what a revenge it was. One day, when Niobe's 14 children were out playing in a field, Artemis and Apollo watched from afar on top of a hill. And then one by one, they picked them off, shooting them down with bows and arrows. Apollo shot down the sons, and Artemis shot down the daughters. Now, when Apollo got to the last son, he had already seen his 6 brothers fall, and in his last moment he sent up a prayer to the gods to save him. Apollo, being a god, heard the prayer, and he would have spared him. But the arrow was already loosed, and the boy died. By the time Artemis got to the 7th daughter, who was a very young girl at that time, Niobe had rushed out. She saw her 13 dead children. She wrapped that last girl in her arms and said, "Please spare me this one child." And Artemis would have, but it was too late. And the little girl died in Niobe's arms. And it is said that Niobe stayed in that spot and wept for so long that the gods took pity on her and turned her into a stone. And still, a stream trickled over that stone. A symbolism, a symbol, a representation, whatever you want to call it. Even as a stone, Niobe continued to weep. That was a bedtime story that my parents read to me as a small child. We had this big book of Greek myths that they would read from. That was one of them. There was Atalanta and Hippomenes, the story of 2 lovers who got turned into lions because they forgot to honor Aphrodite at their wedding. Then there was Phaeton, who was allowed to steer Apollo's chariot of the sun because, he was Apollo's son, his male child, not his son. Yeah, you know what I mean. And he did such a bad job that Zeus threw him out of the sky, set his hair on fire. And then, of course, there was the dozens and dozens of nymphs who chose to turn into trees rather than deal with a god, usually Apollo, trying to woo them. This is what I grew up on. Not The Little Engine That Could or Little Red Riding Hood, no. My sister and I grew up on tales of hubris and sorrow. Emphasis on the sorrow part. Couple that with the fact that my parents didn't really give a rat's ass about censoring anything that was on TV. And I had a lot of, shall we say, mature things bouncing around my head at a very young age. Which means that I would go to school and I would vent this kind of crap onto my teachers. So we'd be reading a cheery little story about an ant who didn't want to be crushed by a boot. And I would say, "That's not right." And the teacher would say, "I can see you're a deep thinker, but we're not talking about that right now." Which, of course, I definitely haven't sat on for a decade and stayed bitter about and thought about late into the night. The point is, I learned very young how a simple transgression can have a steep punishment. Unfair, yes, but true. Yeah, maybe you just disrespected someone, but you could die. We've seen that today. People disrespect a police officer and then they die. Sometimes they don't even disrespect the police officer, they still die. I'm getting away from myself. The lesson remains. I've never sassed a god and been condemned to pushing a rock up a hill for all eternity, but I still understand. And this is not to say that other folk tales don't have grimness and good lessons, but I think Greek myths have this kind of pigeonholed because they're like famous for it, for the petty gods and all that stuff. And more and more in my life, I'm seeing how relevant that really is. People really are that petty, and while they may not have the power to turn you into a spider because you were boasting about the weaving, it doesn't mean they don't want to. Anyway, point is, I learned important lessons from Greek myths as a young child, but also I really don't think you should read them to your children because maybe it's a bit too much. Niobe's story always made me really sad. Still does. Because it was Niobe who committed the offense, but it was her children who paid the price. Before they were mothers, Leto and Niobe had been the most devoted